Rome, the eternal city, once the beating heart of a vast empire that ruled over continents, cultures, and centuries. Its very name echoed power, discipline, and an iron will unmatched in history. Marble columns lined its streets, emperors decreed from gilded thrones, and legions marched beneath its banners in perfect formation, bringing conquest and civilization. But what happens when the mighty forget their roots? When rot seeps into the marble and pride blinds the powerful? Rome did not fall in a single day, nor was it brought down by one army alone. It crumbled from within, its soul torn apart by betrayal, greed, corruption, and desperation. Yet, the final act, the last breath of an empire, was not a whimper. It was war. Brutal, bloody, and unrelenting. This is not just the story of politics, emperors, or barbarians at the gates. This is the story of a dying empire clawing for survival, where citizens turned on each other, generals defied the Senate, and entire cities burned. It's a story of staggering military defeats, shattered alliances, and betrayals that bled the empire dry. In the heart of all this chaos stood Rome, vulnerable and exposed, facing enemies both foreign and domestic. This battle was more than a siege. It was the symbolic collapse of an age ending, drenched in fire, treachery, and blood. You may think you know the fall of Rome, but not like this. Not from the eyes of the desperate, the betrayed, the conquerors, and the defenders. Prepare to witness the brutal final battle for an empire that once ruled the world. At its height, the Roman Empire was an unstoppable force. From the windswept hills of Britannia to the sands of Egypt, Rome commanded legions, dictated trade, and dictated the rhythm of life for over 60 million people. Its armies were feared, its culture revered, and its laws formed the bedrock of Western civilization. But empires, like all things forged by men, are not immortal. They rise on discipline and innovation, but they fall by indulgence, division, and decay. The seeds of Rome's destruction were sown long before its walls were breached. The empire's decline began not on the battlefield but in the Senate. As wealth poured into the city from conquests abroad, so too did corruption. Senators bought influence. Generals chased glory. The gap between rich and poor widened. The once disciplined legions became mercenary bands, loyal not to Rome, but to the generals who paid them. Civil wars became routine. Emperors were installed and murdered in the same year. Rome became a playground for the powerful and a prison for the people. By the 3rd century, Rome had split into two halves: the Western and Eastern Roman empires, while the East held on with its wealthy capital in Constantinople. The West was plagued by instability, underfunded armies, and crumbling borders. The once proud city of Rome itself became more symbolic than strategic, yet it remained a powerful image. The capital of an empire, the jewel of civilization, the heartbeat of Roman identity, and it was precisely that symbolism that made it a target. The external pressures mounted relentlessly. Germanic tribes, pushed westward by the advancing Huns, stormed across the Rhine. Vandals, Visigoths, tribes once considered scattered and disorganized, now moved with military precision. They weren't just looters, they were conquerors. Rome's western provinces fell one by one. Gaul was lost. Hispania, fractured. North Africa, a crucial grain supplier, captured. Still, the city of Rome stood unconquered, defiant, proud. But inside the city, the truth was dire. Political leadership was unstable. The people were starving. Armies were stretched thin, and morale was lower than ever. Emperors came and went like shadows, often little more than figureheads for more powerful warlords. And then came Alaric I, leader of the Visigoths, was no mere barbarian. He was once an ally of Rome, trained in its military systems, familiar with its tactics. Betrayed and denied land and recognition, he turned his sights on the city he once served. His demand was simple: justice, land, and legitimacy. Rome refused. And with that refusal came the storm. This is the moment everything unraveled. Not just the siege of a city, but the collapse of an identity. What follows is the brutal, chaotic, and heart-wrenching story of how Rome, the greatest city of the ancient world, fell not just to invading armies, but to the weight of its own sins. The empire didn't die with a final decree. It died in the screams of battle, the collapse of marble walls, and the burning of centuries of glory. The decline of Rome was not marked by a single event, but rather a relentless unraveling of centuries of dominance. And yet, there came a moment when the decay could no longer be denied. A moment when Rome, once invincible, found itself besieged, not just by enemies from without, but from within its very soul. By the early 5th century AD, Rome was a shadow of its former glory. The glory days of Augustus Trajan and Marcus Aurelius were long past. The legions that had once swept across the known world had either been disbanded or were now composed of mercenaries, men who fought not for Rome but for gold. The emperors were puppets, their strings pulled by corrupt officials, generals, and sometimes foreign powers. Power no longer resided in Rome. but in revenge. And even there, it was unstable. Into this fractured world stepped Alaric, king of the Visigoths, a man who had once served Rome, who had marched with its legions, and learned its language, laws, and military strategies. Alaric wasn't some ignorant barbarian bent on mindless destruction. He was tactical, intelligent, and perhaps most importantly, the empire he once admired had denied him recognition, insulted his people, and betrayed its agreements. He had tried negotiation, he had tried diplomacy, but Rome refused to listen. Now, he would make them hear. In 408 AD, Alaric began his campaign through Italy. His army, numbering tens of thousands, moved with terrifying precision. Town after town fell. There were no legions to stop him, only scattered forces and frightened governors. The roads that once carried Caesar's armies now led the Visigoths straight to the gates of Rome. When Alaric first arrived, the walls of Rome still stood tall and imposing. But the strength behind them was gone. The city had not been the capital for years, and its defenses were neglected. Worse still, the city's population had swelled with refugees fleeing from other parts of the empire, putting an immense strain on its already dwindling food supplies. As Alaric encircled the city, he cut off trade in food. Famine quickly set in. Bread, once a staple of Roman life, became a luxury. Families began trading silver and gold for moldy loaves. And when the silver ran out, desperate citizens resorted to darker choices, eating rats, leather, and even the flesh of the dead. The Tiber carried not life, but the stench of decay. Inside the Senate, panic spread, but arrogance still held sway. Many believed Alaric could be bribed to leave. They offered him a modest sum, barely enough to supply his army. Alaric laughed. "The thicker the hay," he is said to have replied, "the easier it is to burn." Still, Alaric waited. His siege was not only military, it was psychological. He knew that starvation, panic, and internal division would do what his swords could not. Rome was being hollowed out from the inside. Riots broke out. The poor blamed the rich. Pagans blamed Christians blamed the emperor. And the emperor Honorius was hundreds of miles away, doing nothing. At one point, the Senate offered to raise a Roman army of gladiators and slaves to repel the Visigoths. It was a tragic sign of how desperate the city had become. Gladiators were trained for sport, not battle. Slaves had no loyalty to Rome. The very thought was both pathetic and terrifying. Rome, the city that had once sent legions to conquer the world, was now considering arming its entertainers and prisoners for defense. In 410 AD, after nearly 2 years of blockade and intimidation, Alaric prepared for the final blow. But it wasn't through siege towers or catapults that he breached the city. It was treachery. One night, slaves within the city, starving and hopeless, opened the Salarian gate. The Visigoths poured in. For 3 days, the eternal city became a hunting ground. Alaric's men stormed the palaces of the wealthy, pillaging gold, artwork, and anything of value. Statues of emperors were smashed. Temples were stripped of their marble. Fires raged unchecked. The screams of citizens echoed through streets that had once celebrated triumphs and parades. And yet Alaric showed restraint. He had ordered his men not to desecrate Christian churches. St. Peter's Basilica and other holy sites were spared, offering a brief sanctuary to those lucky enough to reach them. But elsewhere, there was no mercy. Nobles were slaughtered. Women were taken. The Senate was humiliated. Rome had not fallen with dignity, had been humbled, reduced to prey before the eyes of the very world it had once ruled. This moment, the sack of Rome in 410 AD, sent shockwaves across the empire. In Constantinople, people wept in the streets. Even in far-off provinces, the news was met with disbelief. How could Rome? St. Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" But the devastation did not end there. Rome rebuilt, but it never recovered. It became a city of ghosts, its population reduced, its pride broken. The sack exposed the empire's vulnerability. Borders collapsed. Usurpers rose. One by one, Roman provinces began to fall like dominoes. In Britain, Roman authority vanished. In Gaul, Germanic tribes carved out kingdoms. Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals, cutting off vital grain supplies to Italy. And then came 455 AD. This time, the Vandals arrived under King Genseric. Unlike Alaric, Genseric had no illusion of restraint. His sack was ruthless. Churches were looted, sacred relics were stolen, gold, silver, and even the bronze from public monuments were stripped away. The Vandals tore through the city for 14 straight days. This time, the damage was cultural, spiritual, and deeply psychological. The word vandalism would enter our vocabulary because of the destruction they wrought. In the face of such humiliation, Rome became irrelevant. Ravenna, Milan, and Constantinople became more important. Emperors in the West were no longer rulers. They were some lasted mere months. Others never set foot in the capital. The once mighty Senate debated over shadows. Rome became symbolic, its real power vanished into the past. By 476 AD, the charade ended. A boy emperor, Romulus, Augustulus, sat on the throne, a puppet placed there by his father, the general Orestes, but even he would not last. That same year, The barbarian warlord Odoacer deposed the boy and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that there was no longer need for a Western emperor. It was not a grand battle. There were no armies clashing beneath the city's walls, no final, epic defense. The Western Roman Empire ended not in fire, but in resignation. A simple political maneuver ended 1,000 years of dominance. The silence was deafening. Yet even after the final emperor fell, Rome's story did not end. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for another millennium, preserving Roman law, Christian tradition, and elements of imperial glory, but it was never truly Rome. That soul, that spark, had died long ago in the ashes of 410 and 455. What remained was idealized, mourned. Meanwhile, the territories of the Western Empire descended into what would later be known as the Dark Ages. Infrastructure collapsed, trade routes vanished, cities emptied, roads were no longer safe, literacy plummeted, science and philosophy gave way to superstition and survival. The light of Rome had gone out, and with it, the stability that had bound a continent together. But even in darkness, the ghost of Rome lingered. Medieval kings styled themselves as Caesars. The Holy Roman Empire, founded centuries later, was a direct attempt to reclaim the legitimacy and power of Rome. Even though it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, the Church, particularly the Catholic Church, emerged from the chaos as a powerful force, taking over many of the administrative, spiritual, and even political functions once handled by Roman officials. Bishops became de facto governors. Cathedrals were erected where temples once stood. Rome's architecture might have crumbled, but its influence flowed through every legal code, language, and belief system of Western Europe. In this strange way, Rome never truly died, it transformed. But the fall, the brutal battle for the city itself, remains a singular moment in human history. A warning etched in fire and stone, a civilization brought to its knees, not by a single army, but by a cascade of failures. Economic ruin, political chaos, military overreach, cultural arrogance, and a refusal to adapt. The battle for Rome was never just about who held the streets or controlled the palaces. It was about identity, about the cost of power without purpose, glory without governance. It was the judgment of history delivered in sword and flame. And what makes this story so timeless, so chilling, is how familiar it feels. The names may change, the cities, the leaders, the nations, but the story of a great power brought low by its own hubris, turning inward as enemies gather at the gates. That is a story we see repeated time and again. The lesson of Rome is clear. No empire is eternal. Not the mightiest legions, not the richest coffers, not even the most brilliant minds can prevent collapse if decay begins from within. The final battle for Rome was not a single war, it was a reckoning, centuries in the making. And when the reckoning came, it was merciless. Rome did not fall in one day. It fell in 1,000 cracks. It fell in broken promises, overreaching ambitions, and forgotten virtues. The battle for Rome was not just the end of a city, it was the end of an era, the final breath of a civilization that once claimed it would last forever. But in its fall, we are left with Ecos lessons, carved in stone, whispered in ruins, and written in blood. Power is not permanent. Wealth cannot replace unity. And empires, no matter how grand, must serve their people or perish by their neglect. Today, we walk among the ruins of that past. The Colosseum, the Forum, the Palatine Hill. Tourists come and marvel, but behind every column is a story of triumph and of downfall. Rome teaches us not just how to build, but how to crumble. And perhaps more importantly, how to rebuild again. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. So as we look at the rise and fall of great nations in our own time, let the memory of Rome be both a warning and a guide. If this story moved you, if it sparked questions or curiosity, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, learn from it. And if you want to see more powerful stories from history brought vividly to life, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with those who hunger to understand the past that shaped our present. Because when we forget history, we risk repeating it, and there may not always be another Rome.